All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first breakout session for the day. My name is Caitlin Baker. I am the Senior Creative Manager here at GovLoop. I also have my cat Penny with me here today, who very much wants to be a part of this session. I hope you enjoyed our opening keynotes this morning with Mel and Adrian. I thought they were just really fantastic, engaging way to start the day. We'd love any feedback that you have about them. And I'm also really excited to get into our breakout session for today, which is Beyond Leaning In, Allyship Across Genders and Generations. So what is this about? A lot of the advice for professional women and people of color focus on the need to lean in, but what about the barriers to doing so, or the unequal rewards and penalties when women do lean in? Achieving equity requires that women and men work together to tackle systemic and cultural challenges and examine how these look different for rising leaders compared to previous generations. So today we have our expert Melanie, who will discuss the major challenges that women face as they advance the career ladder and how to navigate that as a woman and or a person of color. Thank you, Penny. So before we get into that, we do have our fun housekeeping stuff to go over first. If you are on Twitter, please tweet with us. You can follow at NextGenGov and use our hashtag NextGenGov. We'd love to hear what you're learning and what your feedback is on our summit today. We also do have that Q&A portal. So there's kind of two ways that you can chat with us today. The Q&A portal that's already open, you can send questions directly to us for Melanie to answer. And then if you go on the bottom of your console, there's a group chat on the bottom right, and that will open up a chat that's for all of the attendees where you can kind of have conversations, share experiences, all that fun stuff. If you do have any technical difficulties, throw things in the Q&A chat too, and my colleague Kelly will get to you with any answers. We have a lot of resources available today. The resources panel open on your screen has the slide decks and any other tons of other resources that you might want to download. Outside of this, though, in the main console environment, you can download all of the slide decks for today in our resources tab there. And last but not least, this event will be available on demand after. We'll send you a link. You'll get all of the trainings, all the other breakout sessions that you can't make it to today, as well as this session if you'd like to view it again. So we are offering a CPE credit for your participation today. There's 3 things that you have to do to get the CPE. You have to attend this online training for the full duration. You have to take the polls. There will be 3 throughout the session. Please take all of those polls and click the submit button to send them in. And then you have to complete the evaluation afterwards. That evaluation can be found in the resource module, and then you can also find it in the Resource Center in the main virtual environment. With that out of the way, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Joining us, we have Melanie Ho. Melanie is the founder of Strategic Imagination, a firm dedicated to drawing on the power of the imaginative arts to drive transformational change. She believes that today's wicked problems won't be solved unless we find new ways of getting past trapped mindsets, and that the tools of fiction, theater, and the visual arts can help pave the way. Across the past 20+ years, Melanie has delivered over 1,000 presentations to a wide range of audience sizes and types. So without further ado, Melanie, the floor is yours. Oh, I think you're on mute, Melanie.
Oh, rookie mistake. Sorry about that. Well, thank you, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm excited to be here, and I really see this hour together as just the beginning, hopefully, of a conversation together, of a journey as we talk about these issues. So I'll share my contact information at the end. Please feel free to contact me. I'll also direct you to a lot of free resources where you can go deeper on any of the issues that we discussed today. As Caitlin mentioned, I hope you'll make use of the Q&A box. I won't look at it throughout, but at the end, we'll reserve some time where we'll talk through some of your questions. Now, as we begin, I'd like to actually begin with a question for all of you. And if you could just please put in the chat, really, there's no wrong answers here. The first thing that comes to your mind, what do you think are the common emotions for people to feel when they are about to attend a diversity, equity, and inclusion training at work? And again, first thing that comes to your mind. Can be multiple emotions. These are exactly the emotions I often hear: uneasiness, and honestly often feel myself too. Uneasiness, caution, nervousness, anxiety, fear. Because the truth is, as much as so many of us want to have these conversations, want to advance the cause for diversity, equity, and inclusion at work, are hopeful that we can solve some challenges, there's also often worry. There is fear. What if I say the wrong thing? Why are we doing this? Did something go wrong? There might be shame or guilt. Maybe I did say something wrong at the last training. There can be worry about reliving a trauma, something that a participant has experienced in the past. And the challenge is that we're dealing with incredibly complex topics while at the same time we have a lot of different emotions. So the first thing I like to say at the beginning of any discussion like this is that's completely normal. There is going to be a complex set of emotions that we all feel when it comes to any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And a lot of my mission, why you'll see I use things like comics to talk about gender equity and DEI more broadly, is that my hope is that comics, art, fiction can be another way of engaging with these challenging topics and help us almost let our guards down. I'm hoping that you all take away 3 things today. First, we'll talk about why I wrote a book called Beyond Leaning In, and we'll focus a little bit on some of the systemic and cultural barriers. Second, I hope to give us all some frameworks that can be purposeful for 2 reasons. One, to make sense of our own experiences, but second, to improve our allyship. And those 2 things are relevant no matter our identity. And third, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the power of the arts, fiction, and comics to reflect and discuss some of the difficult challenges that we face when it comes to DEI at work. So let me begin with the story behind the story. My book, Beyond Leaning In, which was published last year, and I usually get asked 2 questions when I mention I wrote this book. The first question I get is, why did you write a book called Beyond Leaning In? People always say, I think there's a story there, and there is. And the second question I get is, why did you write a business book as a novel? That seems like a little bit of an unconventional choice. So let me start with why I wrote a book called Beyond Leaning In. It began in 2013 when Sheryl Sandberg published her book, Lean In. Now, I'll tell you, at first I was really excited about this book. I had been in an unusual place in my career. I had just advanced to a senior leadership position at the education, technology, and consulting firm that I worked at. And what this meant is that I went from managing 4 people to 70 almost overnight. That came with a lot of harsh realizations. I was learning a ton about leadership, management, how to manage layers, at the same time as I was starting to notice the differences in how the women on my team were treated compared to the men on my team. This was particularly apparent in performance review conversations, because now I had access to conversations about not only all of the staff under me, but also my peers across the firm. Leadership teams often get together and talk about rising talent. And as we did that, I began to notice how often the men were talked about differently compared to how the women were talked about differently. I'll give you a few examples in a bit as we continue on today, but it was something that really this light bulb went off. Like, wow, this goes on a lot more than most people realize. Is this just me? I wonder, do I just work in a strange place? I started kind of obsessively talking to women in other industries and other organizations. It's like if you sat next to me on an airplane, or I happened to meet you in the hallway of a conference and I thought you might be amenable to my questions, I would start asking them. And what I noticed is it didn't matter what the industry was: private sector, government, nonprofit, healthcare. It didn't matter how big the organization was. Women in many different organizations were facing and noticing the same types of challenges, and they were more apparent as women advanced the ladder because they now had this insight into what was going on across their organizations. So when Sheryl Sandberg published Lean In, at first I thought, hey, now we're finally going to talk about gender at work. This is a Facebook executive who has written a book on gender, and everyone was talking about it at the moment. It felt like this cultural moment, like, wow, we're going to talk about these issues. She had before that really gotten her fame for talking about gender through a TED Talk. And the TED Talk was about how women often don't take their seats at the table. When they should sit at the table, they're sitting in the corner. or don't often raise their hands enough. And I love those messages. I think those are 100% true and needed. I had friends who would listen to Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk kind of as a power song almost before they went and asked their boss for a promotion or a raise. So it was wonderful, but that only goes so far. In saying that women need to lean in, it was disregarding what I was noticing, the barriers and challenges that made it harder for women to lean in, the unequal rewards and even penalties when we did lean in, and more. And so I thought, well, her book, though, won't this raise conversations about those things? And what I noticed was actually the opposite. And as I talked to women across industries, across organization types, again, they told me the opposite happened, which was that I think we live in such a busy society. Everybody's staring these to-do lists that seem like they'll never end. And because of that, we often like sound bites, right? We want simple solutions that could be put on one PowerPoint slide. And the phrase lean in was something, not just one PowerPoint slide, right? That's literally 2 words that suddenly became the solution to everything. And so what I would hear in my workplace and in others was that anytime a challenge for women came up or somebody wondered about a gender gap, the answer was always, well, let's just tell the women, especially those young women, to lean in. And it was really putting the blame on the woman that's saying that all of the gender gaps were our fault. And so I mentioned earlier, I had gotten obsessive about it. That continued. I spent several years after that reading everything I could get my hands on, talking to as many women as I could to try to understand the research and why this was happening. I decided to write Beyond Leaning In then as a novel, and I'll explain why, and it'll introduce us to why I also use comics. When I found that there's so much great research out there, but people weren't engaging with it, even people who are passionate about the issues. Because again, we're all busy people. At the end of the day, reading another long book about gender equity isn't how a lot of people are going to spend their time. And so I wanted to provide an entertaining and hopefully engaging way to not just get into the research, but also remember it. My book's based in research. You'll find a lot of footnotes in it, but it actually tells the story of, could be the leader of any organization. It happens to be a CEO of a company. And she is a baby boomer. She smashed a lot of glass ceilings. She has mentored women. And so she's really surprised when she finds that women at younger generations who are rising into leadership are quitting at greater rates. And she's trying to understand why. It's sort of her mystery story. But it goes back and forth between the perspectives of both male characters and female characters. And the reason I wanted to do that was to elucidate the difference between intent versus impact. One of the reasons why I think there's so much discomfort, we talked about those difficult emotions that happen in DEI conversations, is because nobody wants to be biased. Nobody wants to feel like a villain or a bad person. I actually don't use the word unconscious bias very often. I think it's a really important word. But you'll see I use the word mental autocomplete. And that's because I think we have a bias against the word bias. There's a sense that, well, if I did something biased, I must be a bad person. And that's simply not true. We all have biases, and they are often unconscious and unintentional. And what I hoped to show in Beyond Leaning, and I hope to show with some of the comics that you'll look at in a bit, is that there are, in my book, no villains. What you see and who you meet is a lot of people who are both of all genders, of all generations, who are trying to do the right thing, but unintentionally not. We'll look at the cumulative effect of day-to-day and systemic challenges. I think a often unintended consequence of conversations about microaggressions is that some audience members leave and say, well, this doesn't sound great, but if they're micro, why does that matter? And then finally, my hope was to help readers develop empathy for characters unlike them. And so that's why I go back and forth between characters of different generations and genders. What we'll look at today are some comics based on some of the scenes and concepts in my book. And one thing I want to say before I start is that I go back and forth between what you'll see are comics that are very specific on gender gaps and gender biases, and comics that actually could be relevant to any diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative and any identity group. Racial bias, for example, one of them. To me, this is one of the biggest challenges in DEI, is how to pair discussion that is both specific, because specific identity groups and those who have intersecting identities have different challenges, And yet at the same time, there are things that we can do to support diversity, equity, and inclusion at work that actually are good practice all across the board. I drew this comic to kind of make the point that umbrella DEI initiatives can have diminishing returns. A lot of organizations and employers will start by saying, hey, if everyone just becomes a better manager, that will solve our problems. That will solve some of the problems, but not all of them. We'll look at 5 concepts today. I would love to talk to you about any of these for an hour, but today I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview and again, direct you to a lot of free resources on my website where you can learn more about them. We'll begin with intent versus impact, then go to what I mentioned earlier, how I think of unconscious biases or mental autocompletes. The prove it again versus bet with phenomenon, which is what I noticed most as I started managing more people and seeing the differences in how they were talked about and what was expected of them, and that the research really backs up. 4th, a concept I call points versus assists, which to me is really important when thinking about any kind of allyship. And then 5th, we'll look at a lot of the generational gaps that I think we're starting to see more and more of when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, and here as we talk about gender. First, we'll begin with intent versus impact, and this is a comic I call The Cupcake Trap. On the left side, you see a promotion memo. Now, I made this a promotion memo, but this could be anything. This could be a conversation people are having at the water cooler, or in the absence of water cooler, over Slack or whatever messaging platform of choice. Here, we're congratulating Mike and Mara for their promotions to analytics manager. Mike led the analysis for a critical project that led to $5 million in revenues. Mara has a fantastic work ethic and great baking skills. All of us have gained a few pounds from her cupcakes. Anecdotally, I'll tell you that in my interviews of women across industries, the question of baking came up so often. When is it okay to bake? Is it good to bake? Because then you can diffuse tensions in the meeting. Is it bad to bake? Because you'll be seen a certain way. I'll tell you my own story. Is that I stopped baking when I got to a certain level because I worried about how I'd be seen as a leader. And I started baking again once I became more senior, and I didn't think it was mattered. I'm not saying that as advice. I think all of us have to make these hard decisions. I say it more as the kinds of things that women often deal with at work that no one even knows they're dealing with. Walking around trying to get my work done and then wondering, wait, should I bake? Should I not bake? Am I being judged how I'm being baked? How by being a baker? At the bottom here, we have an individual who's responding to this memo. Maybe he heard a colleague call out that this seemed kind of strange, that maybe Mara should have been recognized for her revenue contribution just like Mike. And he says, what's the big deal? They both got promoted. Often that's the response for something like this. It's not ideal, but doesn't matter. They both got promoted. On the right side of the slide, I want to show some of the impact. These 2 individuals we see on the top left, this could be 3 months later. This could be 12 months later. It could be several years later. Now, their intent in both cases is good because neither of them even knows Mike or Mara. But one of them says, I'm looking for project help. What do you know about Mike or Mara? And his colleague says, I heard Mike is great. I don't know much about Mara. What happens here is that people remember Mike for the revenues versus Mara for the cupcakes. I often lead workshops actually where we discuss this comic, and participants, usually who are non-artists, draw the next 4 strips. And I can give you a bit of behind the scenes of the conversations we have around that, which is that if we think about this promotion memo, there are a lot of people who fed into it. None of them who had probably a malicious intent. None of them who meant to demean Mara. There's the person who hit send on the promotion memo, maybe the CEO of the company who put together all the paragraphs. There's the people who submitted their paragraphs to the CEO, maybe the direct managers of Mike and Mara, maybe their managers. There's the people who maybe gave input to Mike and Mara's reviews so that this information could be put in there. None of them had negative intent. None of them meant for this to happen, but the impact is real, and the impact is one that ripples out in ways that we don't even know. I'll often have participants who look at this comic and even speculate, well, what are all of the negative things that you think could happen? Imagine you're someone at this organization who has a goal. the person picks Mike instead of Mara for a project and the project doesn't go well. There could be a younger employee who looks up to Mara and is disheartened when they see this memo because they wonder if their contributions won't be recognized. There could be someone who looks up to Mara and says, oh no, I'm not a baker. Will I not get promoted? And there's so many different ripple effects that we don't even realize. I mentioned this as an example of intent versus impact because I think here there's just so many ways where we can see that good intent still led to negative impact. And that's one phrase I often recommend people incorporate into your vocabulary when it comes to dealing with DEI issues. I know I personally have used it. I remember earlier in my career, I had an occasion where I was in a meeting where a senior manager who was a mentor of mine said something to undermine me in the meeting. He didn't mean to. He's somebody who actually had really advanced my career and supported me throughout it. But it was something that just sounded a little chastising. This was way before the days we were always on video conference and Zoom, but it was recorded because it was actually a meeting where several of the members of it were remote. And I didn't want to get him into trouble. He was someone who mentored me a lot, but I showed it to I played the recording for our chief diversity officer. And I said to her, am I imagining things? Or does this not sound right? She said, no, you're not imagining things. And I think that is a challenge, is a lot of times when we face biases, we wonder if it's us. She said, it's not you. His tone was a problem, and it was something that did undermine you to the rest of the room, probably. And she said, you have three options. Think about it as intent versus impact. You know his intent was good. This was somebody who had mentored you in the past. You know he doesn't want to undermine you in any way, but the impact on you was not good. And that language is something that can be used to have a conversation. She said, you have three options. You can have that conversation with himself, and she had coached me on using this intent versus impact language. We can have somebody centrally from HR have that conversation with him, kind of a coaching conversation. Or we can have a training for your department to talk about intent versus impact. And I said, I'd actually like all three. I do think we need a broader training. I think the intent versus impact language is helpful, and it helps me feel like I'm empowered to have that conversation. But second, I don't want to have to do all the emotional labor. I'd like someone else to do it as well. And I often tell the story just because I think that language really changed how I have conversations, and it's something that I try to use and also tell people about as an example as often as I can. Next, we'll look at the concept of mental autocompletes. And this is me trying to draw myself at the left there, but the phrase unconscious bias is something I mentioned earlier that can often lead people to shut down. And that's why I like to use the idea of the mental autocomplete. And here's how it works. On the right side, you'll see when the iPhone first rolled out its autocomplete emoji, there was a problem. I noticed that when you typed in CEO, you got a man emoji, and when you typed in doctor, you also got a man emoji. Now, the phone doesn't mean to be biased. Let's get back to intent versus impact, right? Its intent is not biased, but it was programmed to think of CEOs and doctors as men. And I remember when I first saw that on the iPhone, and these are all scenes in Beyond Leaning In, it made me think about how women face mental autocompletes every single day. At the top here, the example where a woman asks for the check and gives the waiter her credit card, and yet the waiter still brings the credit card back to the man, even with her name on it. Even with every single sign, right, is there. Below that, somebody a casual conversation. I'm excited to meet the team. Oh, right, you're going to meet Chad and Haley. They're both marketing directors. Chad is so smart and amazing with data, and Haley, she's the glue of the office. Often that's followed by something like, she's got an infectious smile. What does that mean? Why is Haley being introduced that way and Chad being introduced another way? That's our mental autocomplete at work. And I wanted to show here, it's a woman who's actually saying this, that bias can go in so many different directions. Below that, you can imagine these three individuals who are at some kind of, say, cocktail reception. And the two people on the right there, the CEO and the CFO, just gave a talk. and someone comes up to them and says, hey, Jack, I wanted to introduce myself, go straight talking to the man. I saw in the program that we went to the same business school. I'm very interested in your company. Now, her bio is the CEO is before Jack's in the program. She went to the same business school too, but he's not even pretending. He's pretending that she's not even there. Why does this happen? These autocompletes are so pervasive because our unconscious wiring can overpower the facts. The server's programming that men pay the bills overrides the evidence that the woman's name is on the credit card. At the cocktail reception we just saw, the individual's ignoring the female CEO because she just doesn't fit the image in his head of who can help him. And both women and men can have faulty wiring that leads to describing men by technical skills and women by their social skills. Now, one area where we see the mental autocomplete at work often is what is described by many researchers as the prove it again versus bet with phenomenon. We'll meet Chad and Haley again. So often in performance reviews, this is the conversation. Chad is inexperienced, but he did a great job on that project. Let's bet with and promote him. Versus Haley did a great job on that project, but she's inexperienced. We'll have to see more. I would say stop and just pause and think about this. Exact same language. Chad and Haley are both inexperienced. They both did a great job on a project, and yet the language being flipped and that but having a different role makes all the difference. In Chad's case, the but is the reason to bet with him because the good outweighs the inexperience. In Haley's case, it's the exact reverse. The but is the reason to pause. And so as so much research shows for promotions, she, instead of being promoted based on her potential, has to prove it again and again and again. I think there's a lot of conversation in this country about equal pay. Not as much conversation as we need to have, but there's an equal pay day. People often talk about the wage gap. And what I hope we can start to get to is to begin to realize that equal pay when it comes to wages is only one part of the problem. We've also need to look at equality and equity when it comes to performance review conversations and when it comes to penalty as well. This is a similar example where we have two staff in the meeting who hear about a new policy they dislike. Shannon complains in a brusque tone. Dan actually does something a little worse. He slams his laptop shut. He's so angry about this new policy, and he storms out of the room. Now, I think there's often this perception, this stereotype that women are over-emotional. And yet, in a case like this, one that we often see in the research, when the man in this case is more emotional, the penalty is different. Later that day, the conversation is something like Shannon can't control her temper. It'll really limit her career. Versus Dan can't control his temper, but he's a good guy. Nobody's perfect. We'll now look at points versus assists. I think this is a really important one when it comes to allyship. And it gets to how women and men are often socialized differently, often from a young age, but as we continue through school, as we continue through the workplace. Women are constantly being told to do things like talk louder or interrupt or take up space like men are socialized to do. I think that goes back to this idea of lean in being the solution to gender gaps, that often women are given this kind of advice. And it often starts in not just at home, it starts in school. The question I often ask is, well, why aren't men told to do things like listen and amplify others' voices like women are socialized to do? We have a society where a lot of stereotypically masculine traits, that assertiveness, that interrupting, are valued as needed as confidence, are seen as what leaders need to do, where a lot of quote unquote stereotypically feminine traits, ways that women are often socialized to be more empathic, to be more collaborative. One could argue that those traits are so much more important in leadership today than they've ever been. We need cross-cultural communication. Workplaces are complex. We're facing so much change at paces we never have before. All of that requires these listening skills, these amplifying others' voices skills, and yet they're still often not associated with what a leader should look like. A leader should always be leaning in, should always be talking louder, should always be the one at the front and center of the room. I like to use the metaphor from basketball of points versus assists, because I think it's a great way of thinking about what's valued in meeting culture. Now, I'll be the first to say I am not a sports person at all. I actually use a lot of sports metaphors in my book because I do think that helps some of the male readers get more interested in it. That sounds very, very stereotypical, but it's something that I have found actually does help with conversation. And also I have to have friends who check all my sports metaphors to make sure this makes sense. They make sense. But my dad was a big basketball fan. And so basketball is the one sport that growing up I would watch. And he used to explain to me, like, there are points and there are assists. And he would say to me, people don't pay attention to the assists, but they should, because the team can't win without those as well. And you'll see on the left side of the slide, points might be something like someone in the meeting who says, my opinion is that X, or this is one of my favorites. It's a statement worded as a pretend question. And if someone's trying to get points in a meeting, what they're trying to do is advance their own individual viewpoints and contributions. Now, assists are quite different. Assists are, I know you disagree, and I would like to hear your view. It's not necessarily about agreeing with the person all the time. It's about advancing the organization's collective aims. When I was in grad school, I was in a seminar that was about 80% women and about 20% men. But we found that the men were talking about 80% of the time. And one of the reasons, I'll use another sports metaphor, was that it almost felt like they could do a ping pong match, because there's often discussion of power posing and power sitting in meetings. And the professor sat on one head of the table, and the few guys in the class sat at the other head of the table. And they would just talk back and forth, and the women were in their peripheral vision. And it was like they didn't even see us. My friends and I decided one day to do an experiment. We got to class 20 minutes early before anyone else got there, and we took all the heads of the table and one side. And that forced the professor and the small number of men in the class to sit on one side just with each other. They couldn't see each other and do that kind of volleying and one-upping that they were used to doing in every other class. Now, I don't know, how much was the class different because the women also felt empowered because we got there early and took the seats we wanted? I'm not sure. But I will say that what felt very different in that, what I've noticed a lot since then, just in watching seating dynamics in meetings, was that not only did the women talk more in the meeting, but the way we participated was different. We were purposely trying to pull out each other's ideas to try to get to, hey, how do we advance our conversation as a class around these issues, rather than any single person trying to get their word in. We'll go to our first poll now, because I think meeting culture is so important, and one way that we see a lot of challenges in offices. I'd love to get a sense just from this group of what element of meeting culture in your department or team you think is most in need of change. I've listed a few common ones here. I'm sure there are others. If you have others, please put them in the chat too. But exclusionary small talk or jargon is one. Sometimes that can be related to hobbies. That can be a small group of people who socialize together. And this doesn't have to be about gender or identity at all. A few people dominating discussion, critical perspectives and voices aren't heard, frequent interruptions, or lack of clear collective outcomes.
So we do have a question someone submitted. Do you want to go through that now or at the end?
I was thinking at the end, but while we're waiting on the poll, we can. I guess, is it a quick question while we're waiting on the poll?
I would say it's a very good question. We'll wait till we'll save this one for later.
Okay. Okay, I want to give it time. I can't tell if people have answered the poll. Should I advance it or? Okay. We will look at your answers. It looks like a few people dominating discussion, not surprising, lack of clear collective outcomes. Interruptions. Well, thank you. One book I often recommend is called, this is a great title, a book by a fellow named Pat Lencioni, and the book is called Death by Meeting. And it's a great book to just talk about why we talked earlier about some of the emotions that we have coming into diversity, equity, inclusion conversations. I think we also all have emotions coming into any kind of meeting often, because so often they're not as productive as we want them to be, or a few people dominate and our cultures aren't healthy. So if you're looking at different ways to advance your meeting culture, I highly recommend Death by Meeting. Finally, and I do want to make sure we get to questions after that, we will look at generational gaps. And this is something I cover in more depth in my book and other places, but I just wanted to give a few examples right here. The first one is, I call this comic Mother-Daughter Movie Night. And the mother and daughter here are watching the film My Big Fat Greek Wedding. I don't know if you've seen it. It's one of my favorites, and a scene that I remember sticking out to me when I first watched it. And later, as I started reading a lot of the research on gender at work, thought, wow, this is so relevant. In the scene at the top here, you see the main character, Tula. She's the daughter, and she's talking to her mother, and she's frustrated because she feels like the mother is always deferring to the father when it comes to a lot of major decisions. And the mom says to her, the man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn the head any way she wants. And what the mother and daughter conversation I pictured here at the bottom, the mother says, remember that at work too, get men to think things are their idea. And the daughter says, I don't know, Mom, there's got to be another way. I often use this comic, especially in cross-generational settings, to talk about, I talk to a lot of baby boomer women in particular, and I think it's amazing the kind of explicit bias they had to fight earlier in their careers, and just the overt sexism. And I think because of that, many of them have said to me that on some of these, what can seem like smaller issues because they are not as explicitly out there, they've often felt like they had to look the other way, that they had to play by the rules of the boys' club, so to speak, because that was the only way to get ahead. And I think that now the challenge that we're often having in workplaces is generations who had to do that, and rising generations who are saying, no, we don't want to do that. And just trying to figure out, okay, what do we do in between? I have felt like somebody who's sort of trapped in the middle of that. I'll age myself by saying that I was born in 1979, so that's sort of the last year that counts as Generation X. I consider myself, and I think it's pronounced Xennial, the sort of in-between place, because as I was advancing in the workplace, I often did so by getting men to think things were their idea, for example. And as I tried to figure out what advice to give to younger women and more junior women who would ask me how I got ahead, I certainly didn't want to tell them that that's what I did, but I was honest. And yet sort of trying to figure out, okay, when did what worked for us in the past, when is it still necessary? And when, even if it's necessary, are we not willing to put up with that? Because in the short term, hey, maybe getting someone to think something is their idea helps in this meeting, but in the long game, what does that mean later? And I think that is definitely one, we can talk more about it, but definitely one of the hardest challenges that we face today in figuring this out in the workplaces. Finally, this is actually a comic that I drew just because I think people ask me where I see hope. And I think that one interesting point, I actually wish this got talked about more, is that a lot of the things that women have historically valued at work more than men did, and the things that younger generations of all genders value at work more than previous generations, there's this big Venn diagram overlap. And that's things like authenticity and leadership, inclusive culture, work-life balance, personal meaning at work. And my hope is that this Venn diagram overlap, even though it's hard, even though there are still challenges that we face today, that will help us see more progress. I want to make sure we get to questions, so I will now up with what I hope you'll remember from this. First, intent versus impact. Second, and there we looked at the cupcake trap and the fact that those who wrote the memo certainly didn't intend for, say, 6 months later or 12 years later to have an impact. But we saw the business impact, because if Mike is remembered for the revenues and Mara for the cupcakes, that matters later. Second, we looked at mental autocompletes. Just like the iPhone for a while thought that all CEOs and doctors were men because it was programmed that way, we all have programming as well. Third, the prove it again versus bet with phenomenon. I think that's one where we talked about the but, and I think that's really important to remember. Inexperienced, but did a great job on that project with Chad, versus did a great job on that project, but inexperienced with Haley. Just that different placement makes all the difference. We talked about points versus assists and the difference between advancing one's own viewpoint and agenda versus trying to advance the organization's collective aims. I think that's a particularly relevant in meeting culture, but more broadly relevant in any kind of organization. And related to how men are often socialized to do things like interrupt and take up space, where women are socialized more often to listen and amplify others' voices. And then finally, our generational gaps. The having to play the rules by the boys of the boys club versus the trying to figure out where we can question that, where we can shut that down, and then some of the overlap between what women have historically valued at work and what rising generations now value at work. I've been talking quickly because there's so much I want to talk about, but that's why I have plenty of additional resources for all of you to look at. If you sign up for my mailing list by Friday, I'll send you a PDF of this presentation and also enter you into a giveaway for 5 free personalized sized copies of my book for yourself, or if you'd rather give it to a friend or colleague, you can. And we will put in the chat, but you can see the link there to sign up. You'll also find a lot of free resources on my website. You can download any of these webcomics plus others. Also follow me on Instagram for more. I've got podcast episodes talking through a lot of these issues, blogs, videos. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my goal is to hopefully spark conversation around these topics, have comics that you can share with colleagues that can make these topics feel a little bit more approachable. I'm not a classically trained artist. I'm just somebody who loves to use art and creativity as a way to talk about challenging issues. And here is my contact information for presentations, workshops, or really just to chat. We'll have some time for Q&A, but probably not enough time because there never is. And often you think of questions the next day that you wish you would have asked. So if that happens, please reach out anytime. I reply to every single message I get over email and over social media. Before we get to Q&A, just wanted to do 2 more polls. First of all, so we have those 3 polls, so you get your continuing ed units. But also because I think after sessions like this, it's always good to reflect on what we might do differently afterwards. That just even saying we're going to do something differently makes us more likely to do it. And we'll first start with the fact that we're more likely to remember and benefit from a concept if we discuss it with someone else. And so I'd like you to pick out of 4 of the concepts we talked about today, which of these you commit to discussing with a colleague, friend, or family member in the next few days.
I just want to say thank you, Melanie. I've thoroughly enjoyed this session. I know personally, I think the intent versus impact has really stuck with me as a manager, as a supervisor, like thinking more thoroughly about how I talk about the people on my team and their accomplishments. I try to highlight, what they do and what they bring to the team. But I think it's easy to say like, oh, this person, has a really great sense of humor, and not that they do a really good job at their job, that what they contribute and what metrics they've reached and what goals they've hit. So I really appreciate it. And I know you say you're not an artist, but I am an artist and I cannot draw as well as you have in these comics. So I think you've done a great job. I love this visual format of illustrating and explaining these concepts. I think it's been really awesome.
The first comic I drew, I think which was in a little over a year ago. It took me a day to draw one comic, but I'm slowly getting faster. And one thing I now say to people is that skills are translatable in more ways than we think. I spent years at my former job drawing thousands of PowerPoint slides.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I realized that drawing comics was actually a lot like drawing PowerPoint slides. You just kind of figure out where your eyes goes. So it sounds like lots of people in agreement with Caitlin on intent versus impact, and some on the other issues as well. So that's what you will talk to someone else about. For our last poll, what other next steps will you take? The first might be hold yourself accountable for amplifying others' contributions in my next meeting. If you plan to do that, I recommend actually there's a meeting where you know you want to do that, maybe even putting a reminder on your calendar and a Post-it note next to your computer so that you do that. Attend a bystander intervention training. I think I forgot to talk about this, but I think bystander intervention trainings there's a lot of free or low-cost virtual ones are one of the most important things for DEI. I think a lot of people think of bystander intervention trainings as more learning what to do. I live in Washington, D.C., and the bystander intervention trainings I've been to, often people say they want to use it in case they see someone, say, do something racist on the metro. And I think that's important. It's important to be ready for those moments. But I've actually found bystander intervention training is helpful even for just day-to-day. Hey, if you see somebody unintentionally undermine someone in a meeting, what would you do? And bystander intervention training isn't always about, with the metro example, it's not everyone's going to go put themselves in front of the aggressor. It can be a lot of different ways of, say, getting help or just showing your support to the person who's the victim. Third, use intent versus impact framing to raise specific biases I've seen or experienced. Maybe there's something on your mind now and you're thinking, hey, that language would help me have a conversation. If you're going to do that, I'd recommend just writing down also when you're going to do that. Are you going to do it this week? Put it on your calendar. Fourth, work with leaders and colleagues to examine how we hire and recognize employee contributions informally or formally. Is there an opportunity to get into some policies, for example, where you work? And then finally, other, write in the chat.
Yeah, this is a good one, I think. Especially like amplifying other contributions within meetings, but also like amplifying voices of people in meetings. I know, especially in a remote environment, it can be really hard. I think for women specifically, especially when you're new to the workforce or you're new to a team, to feel that they can step in and kind of interject in a meeting when there's all these voices that are kind of already talking and leading. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind of how we can make space for others to feel that they have a seat at the table, that their voice is valuable and that we want to hear it, especially in the remote world, but also in in-person meetings and things like that.
Yeah, I think especially for those who are leading meetings, but anyone can do this. It's even just keeping a tally, right? Is there any, and not a tally like how many times did someone talk, but just to make sure everyone has talked once. And finding opportunities. I always like to do a lap around the room at the end of smaller meetings just to make sure everybody said something.
Yeah, and I found that sometimes actually calling people, like it's kind of a fine line to walk, right? You don't want to call someone out and make them feel uncomfortable, but if you just say, hey, does anyone have anything to say? So people won't always feel the need, like feel encouraged to speak up in that way. So sometimes it helps. It's really hard in the remote world. It's really something, yeah. So we do have a question in here. Do you want to go over these results first?
Oh, no, let's go to the question. So it sounds like there's a lot of holding accountable for amplifying others' contributions in my next meeting. Love that one. Yeah, and again, I'll just emphasize, even if especially if it's a remote meeting, put it on a Post-it so you remember. If it's not a remote meeting, put it, on the Post-it on your notepad or your computer, whatever you're bringing into the room. Anything that will make you more likely to remember it just in the rush of everything going on.
Absolutely. We did get a shout out for vocalizing the opportunity for bystander intervention training. An appreciation there. So we do have a question from someone. They say, I work in EEO and I'm currently working with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, I have so many people come up to me feeling as if they have said the wrong thing and as if their opinions, even as a minority, are looked down upon by other minorities. Do you have any suggestions on how to work toward a more inclusive environment when dealing with issues like these?
I think there are a lot of great trainings and books on psychological safety. So I guess I'll start with that and research on how psychologically safe teams are actually more effective when it comes to their organizational goals and outcomes. So I will, I suppose, start with that if there's a way to even get that language used in organizations, I think a lot of leaders, managers, people who run meetings just don't even realize that vocabulary is important. So starting there, like my mind's running through lots of things. You know, it's hard to say without knowing some of the specifics. I have appreciated organizations that take a page from social justice movements and do things like racial caucusing, for example. So I have seen some organizations have some success. Now, the follow through is harder with, for example, there's a day of sessions and there's a day of sessions for everybody who talking about, say, a topic like racial trauma and how it works. Then a session that is actually just for people of color, a session that is just for allies who do not identify as people of color, a session for just managers. And I think it's really tricky to do, but finding a way to have those conversations in different groups and then bring people together at the end or in future meetings, it can help foster that conversation of, okay, it's okay to talk about these things. It's hard to talk about different things. We're going to find the vocabulary to do it.
Absolutely.
I'm going to keep thinking about that question, though. So let me look at the chat. Emily, feel free to email me. I'd love to talk more.
I have a question too that I was just kind of thinking of. Do you have any tips, particularly on the generational gap, for how to deal with, like, say, if your manager is in a different generation and they have these mindsets and you have to kind of work with that as your manager? Like, do you have any tips for how to navigate those conversations?
That's one area where I do feel like the intent versus impact language really matters a lot. Because I was thinking about sort of back to the emotion, what's the emotional response behind someone being resistant? And often it's sort of it can be a fear and defensiveness. It can be feeling like they're being called out as a bad person. Or it can be often feeling like, well, you don't understand what the bigger issues are. And so I feel like intent versus impact language automatically can help people's defensiveness come a little bit down, because it's saying, like, I'm not saying you're a bad person for not getting this. These are some of the impacts that I'm starting to notice. So that's probably my tip number one. And tip number two is to figure out what the incentive structures are, or whether this, and I say incentives, I don't necessarily mean money. Mm-hmm. I mean, when it comes to, when I think about the challenges that senior leaders and executives face, there's just so many things they're trying to get done. And even something that doesn't seem like it should stop that from happening, in their head often it is, right? Like if we're raising, for example, that a hiring process actually might be biased, because maybe the hiring process looks at what college or university people went to, and people are using that too much as a factor in decisions, and you want to get rid of that. But the hiring manager, maybe HR, is incentivized by how fast they fill a position, and that shortcut leads people to make decisions faster. And so you kind of have to get at the root cause of, like, oh, well, wait, maybe we need to change the fact that they're measured on speed. And until we get to that, we don't necessarily know what's the systemic reason why someone is objecting to a change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a good comment in the chat too about kind of frustration with supervisors who don't take an interest in getting to know other generations and the people that they're working with and understanding their habits and kind of thought processes. I think that's kind of the baseline, right? It's just understanding where people are coming from and working within that, but assuming the best. I like to, we have that kind of phrase at GovLoop, like assume the best, which is kind of the intent versus impact. Like people don't mean for things to come off this way in a lot of ways, and they're really, I think for the most part, people are out here trying their best, and so it's coming in with that approach and saying, okay, you know, how can we be better? How can we get better starting here?
I love the idea of reverse mentorships, and I wish more employers would incorporate this. So I think a lot of people have mentoring programs, but a reverse mentoring program, which could be paired with a traditional mentoring program, or could be a separate one where someone senior is paired with somebody more junior. And that can have so many benefits. It can help them realize more about, you know, usually more junior people are actually on the front lines, more directly getting intel on what's going on the ground with whatever outcome you're trying to accomplish at your job, but can also help senior people understand what's going on culturally. And I think this is a good moment with the Great Resignation and people worried about employee retention to implement some things like reverse mentorships, because too often I think some of the older generations perceive the younger generations. It's like, oh, the only thing they could teach me is about, I don't know, TikTok or something. Like, no. There's actually a lot of issues that have nothing to do with technology.
Yep, absolutely. I love that idea. All right, well, we are getting close to the end here. So I just want to say thank you, Melanie, again, for your time today. Thanks for this presentation. I think it's been really wonderful. Encourage everyone to go to the link that was shared and sign up for the newsletter, and then also get a chance to win the book. So before we go, just a quick thank you to our 2022 NextGen Partners Alliance. All of these lovely partners are on here. These are the companies that are the reason we are able to be here today and to offer this training for free. So thank you so much to all of them. So next up, we have the rest of the day. We're just kind of getting started. So this session will be on demand for you to watch and share with colleagues. After this, you'll get an email for the whole day summit sent out later this week. We also have the leaderboard going on, which Emily mentioned earlier in the keynote. So you can rise up the leaderboard by taking actions such as downloading resources, attending trainings, all of that fun stuff. Getting to the top of that will get you the option to win some books and other prizes that we have. If you are looking for some CPE credits for today, just make sure to take the evaluation to earn your credit. That's on the resource tab in this console. If you miss it here, it'll be in the resource center in the main environment. And then if you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to email us, nextgen@govloop.com, or you can head to the help desk and they can also answer some questions there. So we have a short little break, and then we have our lunch keynotes today. Those are listed on the screen. And then after our lunch keynotes, we have another round of breakout sessions this afternoon, another 5 choices that you get to choose from. So I am very excited for the rest of the content. I love NextGen. This is my favorite event of the year. I look forward to it every year, and I'm really happy to be here. So thank you again, Melanie. Thank you, everyone who attended today. I hope you enjoy the summit.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.